Chapter 5. The Red Terror. The Jewish-controlled media uses the word Holocaust, with a capital H, today, in reference to what purportedly happened to Jews at the hands of Nazi Germany during World War II. But the real Holocaust of the 20th century was that which the Jews inflicted upon the Russian people during and after the Russian Revolution of 1917. This was one of the bloodiest episodes in history, during which vast millions of Russian Christians were murdered. The aim of the new Jewish overlords was to completely eliminate the upper classes, or the possessing classes, collectively known as the bourgeoisie, including men, women, and children. The most intelligent, most able, most high-achieving segment of the population was wiped out, leaving a population of ignorant workers and peasants. Even the Tsar and his family were murdered by the Jews. In order to bring about their new Marxist utopia, the old Russian culture would have to be completely deracinated and replaced by the new Marxist culture. By the time the Bolshevik Jews completed the extermination of these classes, the old Russia portrayed in the novels by Tolstoy, Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, and Gorky simply did not exist anymore. After gaining control of the state, the Jews began to extend their control to every corner of the Russian government and of Russian society. In order to overcome opposition and to subdue the Russian population, a secret police organization was established in December 1917 called the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, known by its acronym CHECA. At this time, a half-dozen other political parties were in existence, in addition to the Bolshevik Party, all of which were also controlled by Jews. One of them was the Socialist Revolutionary Party, or the Left SR Party. When the Left SR Party revolted against the Bolsheviks, the Cheka rounded 350 of them up and summarily shot them. Ironically, most of the members of the SR Party were also Jews. On August 17, 1918, a young military cadet assassinated the Jewish head of the Petrograd Cheka, Mosai Uritsky, in retaliation for the execution of his friend and fellow cadet. Soon afterwards, on August 28, 1918, the Jewess Fanya Kaplan, a member of the Left SR Party, incensed over the execution of her fellow party members by the Cheka, nearly succeeded in assassinating Lenin. In reaction to these two events, the Bolsheviks began a bloody wave of persecutions, which became known as the Red Terror. The Red Terror was set in motion within hours of the attempted assassination of Lenin by the Jewess chairman of the Central Executive Committee, Yakov Sverdlov, in an official decree. The decree called for a merciless mass terror against all the enemies of the revolution. All political parties were banned, and some 800 members of the Soviet Socialist parties, both the Left SR and the Right SR, were rounded up and shot. In addition, 6,300 other political enemies were also reported to have been shot within the first year, though this number is almost certainly greatly understated. An unrestrained orgy of rape, torture, summary executions, and murder all over Russia on an unheard scale then ensued, carried out by the Cheka. Whole populations were liquidated, including independent farmers known as kulaks, ethnic minorities, the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, the landed gentry, senior military officers, intellectuals, artists, clergy, opposition members, and anyone else who aroused the slightest suspicion. Bolshevik leaders openly proclaimed that the Red Terror was necessary for the extermination of entire social groups, especially the former ruling classes, in order to make the way for the dictatorship of the proletariat. The Jew, Martin Latsis, chief of the Ukrainian Cheka, explained in the newspaper Red Terror, quote, "We are engaged in exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. Do not look in the file of incriminating evidence to see whether or not the accused rose up against the Soviets with arms or words. Ask him instead to which class he belongs. What is his background, his education, his profession? These are the questions that will determine the fate of the accused. That is the meaning and essence of the Red Terror." Close quote. The Cheka grew rapidly and became a very large, very cruel state security organization. Its organizational structure was changed several times over the following years and was its name from Cheka to GPU to NKVD and finally to KGB. But its mission remained essentially the same: Cheka officers were set up in every city and town. By 1921, a single branch of the Cheka called the Troops for the Internal Defense of the Republic, numbering 200,000, was given the responsibility of policing and actually running the massive gulag system of labor camps. There's no way to know the precise number of deaths the Cheka was responsible for, but it surely ran into the scores of millions. This would include victims of forced collectivization, the forced famine, of which more later, large purges, expulsions, banishments, executions, and mass death in the Gulag. Harvard historian Richard Pipes, himself a Jew, in his book The Russian Revolution of 1990, verifies that 3/4 of the staff of the Cheka were Jews, many of them riffraff, incapable of any other work, cut off from the Jewish community, although careful to spare fellow Jews. Russian poet and writer Vladimir Solukin, in Bloodlust of Bolshevism, wrote that 50% of the Cheka were Jews and with Jewish names, while 25% were Jews who had taken Russian names. The remaining 25% was made up of Lets or Latvians, Poles, Georgians, and other minorities, but very few members of the Cheka were ethnic Russians. Moreover, of the non-Jewish members, a significant number of them had Jewish wives. Conclusion: the Cheka was a Jewish organization formed as the enforcement branch of the now Jewish-controlled state. These Cheka members had no compunctions about killing Russians, as they were not ethnic Russians themselves. In fact, they harbored a deep, burning hatred for Russians and eagerly looked forward to the opportunity for revenge. Every single one of those in supervisory positions in the Cheka were Jews. The first head of the Cheka was Moses Uritsky, a Jew, who was soon assassinated. His successor was a Polish communist revolutionary from a noble family named Felix Dzerzhinsky. Dzerzhinsky was a non-practicing Roman Catholic, but was what has been called a Jewified non-Jew. Some sources say he was half Jew. He spoke Yiddish, and his family spoke Yiddish, so he may well have been. Dzerzhinsky's second-in-command was the Jew I.S. Unschlicht. The torture branch of the Cheka was controlled over the years by Genrikh Yagoda and Yuri Andropov, both Jews, and finally by Lavrenti Beria, who was also not Russian, but Georgian, as was his boss, Stalin. About the Cheka, Felix Dzerzhinsky was quoted as saying, "The Cheka is not a court. We stand for organized terror. The Cheka is obliged to defend the revolution and conquer the enemy, even if its sword by chance sometimes falls upon the heads of the innocent." Creation of the Gulag. Matvey Berman and Natalfi Frankel, both Jews and both members of the Cheka, created the infamous Gulag, which was the largest concentration camp system and the most horrendous slave labor system in history, in which millions of Russian Christians were slaughtered. The Nazi system of concentration camps and slave labor camps, which came later, was minuscule by comparison. Yet the term concentration camp is universally associated, not with the communist Russia and under the Jews, but with Nazi Germany. Everybody knows about Auschwitz today, but who has ever heard of Kolyma, Magadan, the Solovetsky Islands, or the great centers of massive death in Siberia? Only those who have read the works of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. There's no mention of them in the mainstream media. Yet, exponentially more people died in those camps than died at Auschwitz, or all of the Nazi camps combined. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that all the camps were commanded by Jews with names like Rappaport, Solz, and Spiegelgas. But international Jewry has gone to great lengths to make sure that this kind of information does not become common knowledge. When Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, and One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, amongst others, were published back during the Cold War, Solzhenitsyn not only received the Nobel Prize, but also world acclaim for exposing the brutality and inhumanity of the Soviet system. Through the Jewish role in it, though it was never emphasized, all of the books were published in several languages, including English, and were highly promoted both in Britain and the United States. Not so his latest book, 200 Years Together, first published in Russia in 2003, which is about the 200 years the Jews lived in Russia amongst the Russian people. In this book, Solzhenitsyn exposes the Jewish nature of the Russian Revolution and identifies the Jews as the perpetrators of the mass murder of scores of millions of Russian Christians during the Revolution and afterwards. This book, unlike all his others, has yet to be published in English, and no interest has yet been shown by any publishing house in doing so. Jews control the publishing industry in the English-speaking world, and they have no intention of publishing this book in English. Moreover, they have exerted extreme pressure to prevent non-Jewish publishers from doing so. This kind of information is taboo today, and its suppression is strictly enforced. Nevertheless, facts are facts, and sooner or later, someone will translate this book into English. Some parts of it have already been translated into English and posted on the internet. Bolsheviks kill the Tsar. On July 17, 1918, the Tsar and his family were murdered by a group of Jewish Bolsheviks. After the Tsar's abdication, the Bolsheviks took him and his family to the Ural mountain town of Ekaterinburg, which they remained for several months as political prisoners, living in a house under guard by the Cheka. The Tsar, his wife Alexandra, their 14-year-old son Alexis, and their 4 daughters, their doctor, their cook, and 2 other attendants were finally taken to the cellar of the house and shot. The bodies were then wrapped in sheets and dumped into a remote mine shaft. They were later retrieved when word got out about their murders. The Tsar's face was smashed in an effort to make it unrecognizable. They tried burning the bodies, but that took too long. Then they doused the bodies with sulfuric acid and buried them in a shallow grave in a forest outside the city. The murderers were Yakov Yankel Urowski, Alexander Beloborodov, and Philip Goloshchokin, all Jews. The execution of the Tsar and his family was ordered by the Jewish chairman of the Soviet Central Executive, Yakov Sverdlov, real name Yankel Solomon. The Jews had finally achieved their aim. They brought down the Tsarist regime with their revolution and had now killed the hated Tsar himself. As discussed previously, long lists of groups were designated for slaughter. Hundreds of thousands of Cossacks were rounded up and killed. The order was to kill every single one of them. And those who escaped initial roundups were tracked down and killed like animals. The same for the aristocracy. 200,000 members of the clergy, priests, monks, and nuns were systematically murdered in a horrific orgy of bestial tortures. They were reportedly scalped, strangled, drowned, crucified, and subject to any other horrific death their murderers could dream up. Tsarist officers were forced aboard sealed barges by the hundreds. The barges were then towed out to sea and sunk with all aboard drowning. The Jews now controlled everything and were free to indulge their most cherished revenge fantasies against the hated, though now helpless, Russians. Local branches of the Cheka comprised mainly of Jews, many of the lowest kind, and many of them violent, sadistic psychopaths, had total autonomy and were not required to report to anyone in carrying out this nightmare of torture and slaughter. Any Cheka member was completely free, without fear of censure or punishment, to kill, rape, or torture anyone he chose, outside the government, that is. And he could do it in the most sadistic manner imaginable. They not only were not required to justify it, they were encouraged by the highest leaders, including Lenin himself, to show no mercy and to kill as many as possible. The Cheka was an incredibly brutal organization with standing orders to execute at will. What distinguished killings by the Cheka, according to one observer, was that they were rage-fueled. The Cheka agents didn't just kill class enemies, they went at them in orgiastic frenzies, beating, stabbing, chopping, and mutilating them, including men, women, and children. An article in the Defender magazine of October 1933 describes their orgy of killing. Quote, Christians were dragged from their beds, tortured, and killed. Some were sliced to pieces, bit by bit, while others were branded with hot irons, their eyes poked out to induce unbearable pain. Others were placed in boxes with only their heads, hands, and legs sticking out. Then hungry rats were placed in the boxes to gnaw upon their bodies. Some were nailed to the ceiling by their hands or by their feet and left hanging until they died of exhaustion. Others had hot lead poured in their mouths. Many were tied to horses and dragged through the streets of the city, while Jewish mobs attacked them with rocks and kicked them to death. Pregnant women were chained to trees and their babies cut out of their bodies." Close quote. During the second half of 1919, the Red Army was driven out of the Ukraine by the White Army. A number of investigations of mass murders were then carried out by special commissions under the White Army's occupation, one of which was the Rohrbach Commission of Inquiry. There were numerous places of public execution during the Red Army occupation. After the city of Kiev was taken by the White Army on August 1919, Paul Rohrbach was sent by the British government to conduct an investigation. When the members of the Rohrbach Commission entered the execution hall of the Cheka of Kiev, they found, and this is in quotes, "The whole cement floor was flooded with blood. It formed a level of several inches and had stopped flowing or coagulated. It was a horrible mixture of blood, brains, and pieces of skull with tufts of hair and other human remains. All of the walls were riddled with thousands of bullets and bespattered with blood. Pieces of brains and of scalps were sticking to them. A gutter of 25 centimeters or 10 inches wide by 25 centimeters or 10 inches deep and about 10 meters or 33 feet long was along its length full to the top with blood. Some bodies were disemboweled, others had limbs chopped off, some were literally hacked to pieces. Some had their eyes put out. The head, face, and neck and trunk were covered with deep wounds. Further on, we found a corpse with a wedge driven into its chest. Some had no tongues. In a corner, we discovered a quantity of dismembered arms and legs belonging to no bodies that we could locate." Closed quote. In his book, The Secret Powers Behind Revolution, French author Vicomte Léon de Poncin, published in the 1920s, wrote, quote, "The Red Terror became so widespread that it is impossible to give here all the details of the principal means employed by the Cheka to master resistance. One of the most important is that of hostages taken among all social classes. These are held responsible for any anti-Bolshevist movements, revolts, the White Army, strikes, refusal of a village to give its harvest, etc., and are immediately executed. Thus, for the assassination of the Jewish Oritsky, member of the Extraordinary Commission of Petrograd, several thousands of them were put to death, and many of these unfortunate men and women suffered before death various tortures inflicted by cold-blooded cruelty in the prisons of the Cheka." Close quote. In his book, The Bloodlust of Bolshevism, Vladimir Solukhyn wrote that these Jewish Chekists were especially interested in handsome boys and pretty girls. These were the first to be killed. It was believed that there would be more intellectuals among attractive people. He wrote that the Semites, jealous of white beauty, massacred beautiful whites. The Jewish Chekists favored murder with various torture methods. In his documentary film, The Russia We Lost, director Stanislav Govorutkin related how the priesthood of Kherson were crucified. The Archbishop Andronikov of Perm was tortured. Quote, "His eyes were poked out, his ears and nose were cut off. In Kharkov, the priest Dmitry was undressed. When he tried to make the sign of the cross, a Chekist cut off his right hand." Several sources, Govorukhin said, tell how the Chekists in Kharkov placed victims in a row and nailed their hands to a table, cut around their wrists with a knife, poured boiling water over their hands, and pulled the skin off. This was called pulling off the glove. In other places, the victim's head was placed on an anvil and slowly crushed with a steam hammer. Those due to undergo the same punishment the next day were forced to watch. The eyes of church dignitaries were poked out, their tongues were cut off, and they were buried alive. There were Chekists who used to cut open the stomachs of their victims, following which they pulled out a length of the small intestine and nailed it to a telegraph pole and, with a whip, forced the unlucky victim to run around the pole until the whole intestine had been unraveled and the victim died. The bishop of Voronezh was boiled alive in a pig pot, after which the monks, with revolvers aimed at their heads, were forced to drink the soup. Other Chekists crushed the heads of their victims with special head screws, or drilled them through with dental tools. The upper part of the skull was sawn off, and the nearest in line was forced to eat the brains, following which the procedure would be repeated to the end of the line. The Chekists often arrested whole families and tortured the children before the eyes of their parents and the wives before their husbands. Mikhail Voslensky, a former Soviet functionary, described some of the cruel methods used by Chekists in his book Nomenclature, or Nomenklatura, Stockholm, 1982, quote, "In Karakov, people were scalped. In Voronezh, the torture victims were placed in barrels into which nails were hammered so that they stuck out on the inside, upon which the barrels were set rolling. A pentacle, usually a 5-pointed star formerly used in magic, was burned into the foreheads of the victims. In Tsaritsyn and Kamyshin, the hands of the victims were amputated with a saw. In Poltava and Kremenchug, the victims were impaled. In Odessa, they were roasted alive or ripped to pieces. In Kiev, the victims were placed in coffins with a decomposing body and buried alive, only to be dug up again after half an hour. These Chekist Jews took sadistic pleasure in torturing the hated Russians, who were now helplessly under their control. Their methods of torture were limited only by their depraved imaginations. The landowners and estate owners were one of the first targeted classes to be eliminated. In town after town, convoys of Chekist trucks left for the countryside as night began to fall, stopping at one estate or landowner's house after another to collect every member of each family, men, women, children, infants, including the servants. Any who resisted or tried to run away were shot. In those days of no telephones, there was no way to give forewarning to these families so that they were caught completely by surprise. They were brutally beaten with rifle butts and truncheons as they were herded into the trucks, many of them injured and bleeding. These large trucks, a dozen or more at a time, then returned completely filled with their traumatized victims who had no idea what was in store for them. They were, in fact, being taken to clearings in the forest outside of town where bulldozers had already dug their mass graves. These frightened civilians, who were guilty of nothing except of being members of a condemned class, were forced to line up in front of the pits where they were machine-gunned, after which the bulldozers covered them up. The following night, and every night thereafter, the trucks went out again, until all were captured and killed. Only those landowners lucky enough to make it out of the country escaped this fate. These victims were the people who had filled the pages as characters in stories by Pushkin, Tolstoy, and Chekhov, and who were embodied the culture of old Russia. Now they were being systematically wiped out by the alien Jews who had seized control of the country. In 1926, a Russian immigrant known as Dr. Gregor published a 12,000-word pamphlet in Munich, Germany, in which he provided statistics on the numbers killed by the Checha during the Red Terror. These statistics, he said, came from the Checha's own published statistics. According to Dr. Gregor, by 1921, the Checha reported that they had killed 28 bishops, 1,215 priests, and 6,000 monks. The Russian Orthodox Church was one of the first targets for destruction by the Jewish Bolsheviks. Next to be killed were all those Russian classes who had any kind of education or any kind of leadership role within the old Russian society. Of these groups and classes who were rounded up and killed, there were 8,800 Russian doctors and medical assistants, 54,650 Army and Navy officers, 10,500 police officers, lieutenant and above, 48,500 lower-ranking policemen, and 260,000 ordinary soldiers. 361,825 members of the intelligentsia, including teachers, professors, engineers, building contractors, writers, and judges, were killed, and 12,950 large landowners were killed. In these cases of mass murder, there were no explanations or reason given for their murder. The simple fact that they belonged to one of the above classes was the only reason. The tragedy of all this cannot be measured by numbers alone. These people were the best people that Russia had. They were the leader class. They were the priests and lawyers and merchants and army officers and university professors. They were the cream of Russian civilization. The total effect was much the same as it would be in any country. With its small middle and upper class exterminated, Russia's peasant and worker population accepted Jewish Bolshevism without protest. The Russian masses, deprived of its spokesmen and leaders, were simply incapable of counter-revolution. That was what the Red Terror had set out to accomplish. After these elite groups were disposed of, the Cheka turned its attention to the workers and peasants, killing 192,350 workers and 815,000 peasants, according to their own records. These killings occurred between the years 1917 and 1921 and were only those reported killed by the Cheka, according to Dr. Gregor. Certainly there were vast numbers killed by the Cheka and not reported. Dr. Gregor's statistics are only for the Cheka and do not include the millions who died of disease and starvation or those killed by the forces other than the Cheka. In the years following 1921, such killings were to increase exponentially. Jews as a hostile elite. After killing off the old Russian elite, the Jews simply took their places as a new ruling elite, albeit without the elegance and grace of the old elite. Beyond the baggy suits, uncouth manners, and malevolent scowls, there was another important difference between the new Jewish ruling elite and the traditional Russian ruling elite. Professor Kevin MacDonald of the University of California wrote that because the Jews had traditionally been restricted and repressed in Tsarist Russia, quote, the Jews had a long-standing visceral antipathy out of past historical grievances, both real and imagined, towards the people and the culture that they came to administer, close quote. Vladimir Puriskevich, the leader of Michael the Archangel Russian People's Union, accused the Jews of irreconcilable hatred of Russia and everything Russian. The Jews disliked Christians because of the traditional antagonistic relationship between Judaism and Christianity in Russia. According to Kevin MacDonald, when Jews achieved power in Russia, it was a hostile elite with a deep sense of historic grievance. As a result, they became willing executioners of both the people and culture they came to rule. The Jew, Anatoly Vasilyevich Lunacharsky, Lenin's Soviet People's Commissar of Enlightenment, wrote, quote, we hate Christianity and Christians. Even the best of them must be regarded as our worst enemies. They preach love of one's neighbor and mercy, which is contrary to our principles. Christian love is an obstacle to the development of the revolution. Down with love of one's neighbor. What we need is hatred. Only thus shall we conquer the universe. Close quote. Professor MacDonald writes, quote, after the revolution, there was active suppression of any remnant of the older order and their descendants. Jews have always shown a tendency to rise because of their natural proclivities, e.g. high intelligence and powerful ethnic networking, but here they also benefited from anti-bourgeois quotas in educational institutions and other forms of discrimination against the middle class and aristocratic elements of the old regime that would have provided more competition with Jews. The bourgeois elements from the previous regime would have no future. Thus, the mass murder of peasants and nationalists was combined with the systematic exclusion of the previously examined non-Jewish middle class. Closed quote. On October 9, 1920, while Trotsky was still head of the Red Army and laying waste to old Russia, an article in the American Hebrew published in New York stated, quote, what Jewish idealism and discontent so powerfully contributed to accomplishing in Russia, the same historic qualities of the Jewish mind and heart are tending to promote in other countries, closed quote. In other words, what the Jewish Bolsheviks had done to Russia, they were working assiduously to do to Europe. Vladimir Lenin said, "We Bolsheviks are going to bring the social revolution as much to America as to Europe. It is coming systematically, step by step. The struggle will be long, cruel, and sanguinary, or bloody. What matters the loss of 90% by executions if 10% of communists remain to carry on the revolution? Bolshevism is not a seminary for young ladies. All children should be present at the executions and rejoice at the death of the enemies of the proletariat." The Ukrainian famine, or Holodomor. In 1929, the Bolsheviks under Stalin announced their first 5-year plan for rapid industrialization of Russia and collectivization of agriculture throughout the Soviet Union. All the owners of vast estates across Russia had already been killed, along with their families, during the 1917 revolution, but now the Bolsheviks would turn their attention to gaining control over the millions of independent land-owning peasant farmers. Their intent was to eliminate private farms altogether and create giant collective farms in their place. All the peasants were to become employees of the state, working on the collective farms. The Ukraine was the most productive agricultural region of the Soviet Union and was known as the breadbasket of Europe. Ukraine's prosperous, self-reliant peasant farmers were accustomed to a high degree of independence and had long harbored sentiments of Ukrainian nationalism. After the fall of the Tsar, there was widespread support for revival of the Ukrainian culture and of the Ukrainian language, which was similar to Russian, but not the same. The aim of the Ukrainian people, most of whom were peasant farmers, was, if not outright independence, then a high degree of autonomy within the Soviet Empire. By this time, Lenin had died, Trotsky was in exile, and Stalin was in control of the Soviet Union. Stalin was not a Jew himself. He was also not a Russian, but a Georgian. But the vast majority of the positions within the communist bureaucracy were filled by Jews, and most of those who surrounded Stalin were Jewish, including his main associate, Lazar Kaganovich. Stalin and Kaganovich were determined to crush this Ukrainian independence movement and collectivize Ukrainian agriculture with as much speed as possible. What Stalin and Kaganovich intended was the complete destruction of the traditional way of life in the Soviet Union, particularly in the Ukraine, and replace it with Marxist collectivism. The collectivization process was enormously disruptive for everyone and extremely unpopular. Though the collectivization process proceeded more or less on schedule in Russia, the Ukrainians resisted it, to the point that the entire collectivization process in the Ukraine was brought to a standstill. The Ukrainian peasants refused to cooperate, and even slaughtered their farm animals rather than hand them over to the state. Stalin and Kaganovich would not stand for this. In 1932, they unleashed a terror campaign against the Ukrainians, the brutality of which was unprecedented. 25,000 young, fanatical party militants were sent to force the 10 million Ukrainian peasants onto the collective farms. When these 25,000 young militants proved insufficient for the job, a large Cheka force was ordered in to begin mass executions in order to intimidate the population. The resistance continued unabated, so an orgy of indiscriminate mass killing ensued. Quotas were even set for the numbers to be killed. When the Chekists failed to meet weekly execution quotas, Stalin sent in Lazar Kaganovich, his Jewish assistant, along with a cadre of other Jews, to take charge of the situation. The Jew Yakovlev Epstein was put in charge specifically of collectivization. Kaganovich set the shooting quota at 10,000 Ukrainians per week, but there were not enough Chekists to shoot that many people. So Kaganovich and Stalin decided on a much cheaper and much more efficient method of mass murder: starvation. Troops were sent in, and all the seed stocks, grain, silage, and farm animals were confiscated from Ukrainian farms. Chekist agents and Red Army troops sealed all roads and rail lines, letting nothing in and nothing out. Anyone trying to leave was shot. Farms were searched, and all food and fuel was confiscated. There was nothing left to eat. Anyone caught stealing food, even a handful of grain, was shot. Ukrainians began to die of hunger, cold, and sickness in large numbers. The American journalist Eugene Lyons was sent to Russia in 1928 as chief correspondent for UPI. Arriving as an enthusiastic communist, he was able to experience the Soviet experiment at first hand and become totally disillusioned by what he saw. He described the famine in his book Assignment in Utopia, published in 1937, as follows, quote, "Hell broke loose in 70,000 Russian villages. A population as large as Switzerland's or Denmark's was stripped clean of all their belongings. They were herded with bayonets at railroad stations, packed indiscriminately into cattle cars and freight cars, and dumped weeks later in the lumber regions of the frozen north, the deserts of Central Asia. Wherever labor was needed, there to live or die." Closed quote. Lyons, himself Jewish, attributes the responsibility for this crime against humanity directly to Kaganovich. Quote, "Lazar Kaganovich, it was his mind that invented the political department to lead collectivized agriculture, his iron hand that applied Bolshevik mercilessness." Closed quote. Stalin merely enforced Kaganovich's plan. During the frigid winter of 1932 through 33, the mass starvation created by Kaganovich took a drastic toll. Ukrainians ate anything they could find, including their pets, leather boots and belts, tree bark, grass, and roots. Cannibalism became common. Parents even ate their children. The precise number of Ukrainians who died in this deliberate famine, as well as by Cheka shootings, remains unknown. But the KGB's own archives, which have recently been opened to show that at least 7 million Ukrainians died. Ukrainian historians say it was worse than that and put the figure at 9 million. Fully 25% of the Ukrainian population was wiped out by this deliberate, man-made extermination famine. On top of this grim number in the Ukraine, millions of other peasant farmers across the rest of the Soviet Union were also starved to death or shot during this collectivization program. Stalin admitted to Churchill at one of their meetings during World War II that he had been forced to liquidate 10 million uncooperative peasants during the 1930s in order to achieve collectivization. When mass executions by the Cheka in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are added in, the genocide of 3 million Muslims of the USSR, massacres of Cossacks and Volga Germans are added, the total comes to at least 40 million Christians murdered by the Bolshevik Jews during the time they controlled Russia. This orgy of mass murder in Russia was well publicized throughout Germany as well as the rest of Europe while it was happening, and it was also well known that it was done largely by the hand of the Jews. Bolshevism, communism, and Judaism were correctly conflated in the German mind to mean one and the same thing. It is little wonder that the German people felt fear and hostility towards the Jews and saw them as a threat to their own existence.